The prairie was merciless that winter, the wind like knives against the skin, the nights longer than a soul could bear, and Clara James, a girl who once dreamed of books and ribbons and laughter, found herself trudging through snow with her boots split at the seams, her hands raw from begging scraps off strangers who had nothing left to give, hunger twisting in her belly until pride finally broke beneath the weight of survival. And when she stumbled upon the Turner Ranch, its chimney smoke curling against the dying sun like a promise she could no longer resist, she raised a trembling hand and knocked at the heavy door, rehearsing words she never thought she would say, words that left a bitter taste of ash in her mouth. And when the door swung open and Eli Turner stood framed in the lamplight, tall and broad-shouldered, his hat shadowing the sharp lines of his weathered face, she blurted out in a broken whisper, "I'll trade myself for food, for shelter, for a place by your fire." And though the shame burned hotter than the cold outside, she could not take it back, could not undo the confession that stripped her bare. But Eli, a man who had lived too many winters alone, froze not out of desire, but out of grief for the desperation in her voice. And after a long moment of silence, he shook his head, slow and steady, his voice like gravel, yet carrying something gentle. "No, ma'am, you ain't a thing to be traded." And before she could retreat into the night with her pride in shreds, he stepped aside, letting her in, guiding her toward the hearth where the stew-pot simmered, filling the cabin with a smell that nearly broke her in half with longing. And as she sat by the fire with a bowl clutched in her hands, tears spilling unchecked down her face, Eli didn't ask her to explain, didn't shame her further, just sat across the room mending a bridle, giving her silence and dignity. And in that silence something shifted in Clara's heart, a seed planted where only hunger and grief had lived, though she dared not name it yet. For all she knew was that this man had taken her in without asking a price. And for the first time since burying her mother, she slept beneath a roof without fear clawing at her dreams, unaware that the rancher who fed her that night would soon give her something far greater than food or shelter. He would give her back her worth. The weeks that followed stitched themselves into Clara's memory like patches of a quilt, each day rough and unglamorous, yet warmer than anything she had known in months. And though she offered again and again to earn her keep by mending clothes, feeding stock, or scrubbing floors, Eli only nodded, letting her help where she wished, but never once holding labor like a debt, never once letting her believe she owed him more than her own survival. And in that quiet steadiness, Clara found herself healing in ways she hadn't thought possible, her hands regaining strength as she drew water from the well, her cheeks slowly filling with color as stew and cornbread replaced the gnawing hunger that once kept her awake. And though her heart still carried scars from men who measured her worth in what she could give, Ellie's silence and small kindnesses carved something different inside her, something that looked a lot like trust, for he spoke little but worked much, rising before dawn to tend cattle, hammering fence posts into the frozen ground, riding miles to fetch feed, and every evening returning to a cabin that no longer felt empty because she was there, a soft hum filling the space as she sewed by lamplight, or the sound of her laughter spilling when he made some dry remark she didn't expect. And though the words of her first night, her shameful trade, still haunted her, Eli never once alluded to them, never treated her as anything but his equal beneath that roof, until one spring morning, when the thaw had turned the pasture green and the wildflowers began to bloom. In defiance of the harsh winter past, he led her to a patch of land near the cottonwoods and told her he'd been working on something. And there, half built with sturdy beams and a stone hearth already laid, was a room he had been raising with his own hands, a space meant for her, not as a tenant or a burden, but as someone who belonged. And when Clara, stunned to silence, asked him why, Eli reached into his pocket, pulled out a simple silver band worn smooth from his years of keeping it, and said in a voice that shook, "For the first time, because you're not here to trade, Clara, you're here to stay. If you'll have me." And in that moment, the weight of every humiliation she had endured fell away, replaced by tears that ran clean, not bitter, as she whispered yes through the sobs. And he slid the ring onto her finger with hands calloused from work but gentle as a prayer. And though no preacher stood by, no crowd to witness, Clara knew in her bones that this was a wedding truer than any she could have dreamed. For it was forged not in desperation, but in choice, in dignity restored, in the unspoken vow that from now on, her worth was not in what she could trade, but in who she was. And as Eli pulled her into his arms, the prairie wind carried the scent of wildflowers, as if even the land itself was giving its blessing. Life after that moment did not turn into fairy tale ease, for the west was still harsh, storms still battered the fields, cattle still strayed into gullies, and hunger still lurked like a shadow when harvests were thin. But now Clara faced each day not alone, and not with the fear of being discarded, but with the strength of knowing she was chosen, that her hands, once blistered from begging, were now steady at the loom, weaving curtains for the room Eli finished beam by beam, until it was a home that smelled of pine, and smoke and love. And though nights still brought memories of the girl who had whispered shame at a stranger's door, those memories no longer crushed her, for Eli never let her forget the truth when she thought herself filthy. He brushed her hair and called her beautiful. When she thought herself a burden, he hitched her dreams to his own, and when storms came, he stood beside her, hand in hand, proving that worth was never something to be bought or traded, but something to be honored, cherished, and lived. And as the years unfolded, with seasons of drought and seasons of bounty, Clara bore not only the hardships of ranch life, but also the laughter of children, born into their home, her ring glinting against the cradle she rocked, the walls Eli had built standing strong against the winds. And though sometimes she would still stand in the doorway at dusk, watching the horizon where she had once wandered starving and broken, she now carried no fear of that girl, because she had walked into Ellie's life offering herself as a trade. But she had been given back something no coin, no roof, no meal could ever match: her dignity, her place, her family, her forever. And that, dear friend, is the heart of the story, that in the unforgiving land of the Wild West, love was not in grand gestures or sweet words, but in the grit of a man who chose to build a room, and the courage of a woman who dared to believe she was worthy of it. And if this story struck you, if Clara's journey from shame to belonging stirred something deep in your chest, then don't write off just yet. Hit that subscribe button. Join this trail of stories, because there are countless more tales of cowboys, courage, and redemption waiting under the wide open sky. And we'd be proud to have you ride with us.